Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Hello, Teresa.
It's good to be here and to, I guess it's good to talk about the Crusades continuing. It's good to know, I should say, not that they're very fun to hear about, but they are history that we need to be aware of, and it's relevant history as to what's going on.
Hopefully, if we have time at the end of today, I'd like to do a little reading from the beginning of the book by Thomas Madden about the Crusades, and then also his last paragraph. He kind of puts everything in perspective. So as we're going through, like we've said, the First Crusade was pretty honorable,
right?
Pretty exciting. And then after that, it was like one bad bailout after another. And I think maybe we'll let him put all of this in perspective. But we've got yet probably, I would have to say, this is the worst crusade because it was Christian versus Christian.
Wow.
I wouldn't even say versus, it was Christian on Christian. The Latins took on the Eastern Church. They were there to save it. And then what happens, 150 years later, they're actually attacking the city that asked for their help. But we have to remember that a lot of times these things are done under the guise of religion.
Right.
Religion was not motivating it. These were people who are operating against the will of Pope Innocent III. So let's see this in a. It's a much more complex. Too often we do history black and white. This is much more nuanced, and so if nothing else, we'll have a better sense of that. I think that's one of the things that Dr. Madden points out in his book is that we need to understand this history because we do tend to be very black and white about it, and so we don't understand the shifts and nuances, and so. There we are.
There we are, and yes, we need to remember.
Yeah. Well, if you remember last time around, the city of Zara, a Christian city, fell to the Fourth Crusade. This was done at the insistence and behest of the Venetians, who were transporting the fleet for a price. If you remember, they had a hold on the Crusaders because the Crusaders were not able to come up with enough Crusaders to fill all the ships, and they were not able to come up with enough money to pay for all those ships. And so they were beholding to the Venetians, who were making demands on them, like, for instance, wiping out one of their competitors in the Adriatic, the city of Zara. And remember that as a result of that, the Fourth Crusade was excommunicated by the Pope because they had attacked this Christian city. Well, what happens then is after the deed is done, and it's that old, I'm sure you've heard this before, the old statement that it's easier to seek forgiveness than it is to seek permission. They simply had gone ahead and did what they did, and now they turn around and seek forgiveness. And so Innocent III is caught between a rock and a hard spot. Now, what is he going to do?
Right.
Is he going to refuse to raise the excommunication on these people and hold their feet to the fire? Or is he going to forgive them their sins? Supposedly they're contrite of having done what they did. And so what he does is he absolves the Crusaders, but not the Venetians.
Oh, okay.
His feeling is that these people did what they did with malice aforethought. The Crusaders were kind of duped into this, and so the excommunication was lifted on those who had gone on the crusade, but those Venetian sailors and the Doge Dadalo and all were not forgiven. They continued excommunicated. Well, a new problem comes up. The Venetian, now here you have a situation where you've got Crusaders in the good graces of the church again, but they're being transported by these excommunicated Venetians, and the Venetians just happen to turn around and go, "Oh, by the way, if you look at our contract carefully enough, it specifies that we're supposed to feed you for 9 months. Guess what? 9 months are almost over. So now they've got the ships, but not the food.
Oh my gosh.
So, as they say, logistics is everything. Just at that moment, a Byzantine prince arrives on the scene, comes to the Crusaders at Zara. His name is Alexis Angelus, and he is fleeing from his uncle. Now, his uncle down in Constantinople had led a coup d'etat. He overthrew the government of Alexis's father, Isaac II, and this was in 1195. And this uncle had actually blinded his own brother, the emperor, and of course Alexis was afraid for his own life, and so he fled. He went up to the Crusaders and he said, "Would you come and help me?" And he said, "I'll pay you." And they said, "Well, how much?" And he said, 200,000 silver marks, which comes out to be about 100,000 pounds of silver. 100,000 pounds. Now, this would pay for all the other expenses for the Venetians, and it would also reprovision them for more food. So, does the end justify the means? This is not exactly a crusade, but this is how we'll have to pay to finish off the crusade. And then he says, well, not only that, but if you restore my father to his rightful position, I promise you that I will join the crusade with 10,000 men. Well, that sounds pretty good.
Okay.
And so they're going, whoa, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And he goes, oh, and not only that, but also I'll see to it that the Greek church is restored to unity with the Roman Catholic Church.
Oh.
Whoa. And then he said something about the Brooklyn Bridge, too. But it was just a deal that was too good to pass up, And so the Crusaders took them up on the offer, and so they marched on Constantinople. Huge army, very easy assault on the city of Constantinople, falls right away, and the emperor then is freed and restored. The uncle goes flying off someplace. Alexis is triumphant. He is happy. He's restored the monarchy for his father. He's brought peace back to Constantinople. Everything is wonderful. And now the next thing, the question is, what about the Crusaders? What about their pay? So he says, well, first of all, why don't you stay here over the winter? Because you don't want to be traveling during the winter time. And they go, oh, okay, that's that. And he says, and we'll do it at the emperor's expense. Dad will pay for it all. Oh, okay, that's pretty nice. And so then the Venetians go, yeah, well, what about us? And the emperor goes, okay, I'll pay for the extension of your lease into another year.
Okay.
So the Venetians are, oh, okay. And then the winter happens, and nobody gets around to try to find that 100,000 pounds of silver. It's not there, And by the time the summer comes, and this will be the summer of 1203, the Crusaders are going, hey, we want to get on this crusade. We're just sitting around here. Nothing's happening. And they were constantly being given the bum's rush. And so what happens is the Crusaders decide, well, we got to get your attention. And one of the other earlier crusades, if you remember, the same thing happened. They simply burned down a suburb. So this is what they did also. They simply took an area of the town and burned it down and said, hey, got your attention? And, there were hard feelings on both sides. There was a little bit of violence on both sides. And that's when some of the Crusaders got this idea of, we'll pay ourselves. And so what they did was, instead of just burning down a suburb, they then began going through the city and looting it and simply taking what they wanted. That's not good news.
No.
In the palace itself, there is a revolt. Alexius has gone from being the hero to the goat, and in the process gets himself killed. And now there's a real problem that's come up. These crusaders find themselves, first of all, locked out of the city. You know, the Constantinopolitans simply, when they were gone, they just locked all the doors and closed the gates. The Venetians, their contract had run out, so they took their ships and went back to Venice. And the Crusaders are running short on food, short on provisions. They get a letter from Pope Innocent III, and he says, do not abuse the Greeks. Do not. I'm telling you. Well, instead, what happens is some of the chaplains within the Latin army preached a crusade the opposite of what the Pope had wanted, and instead called upon a crusade against Byzantium.
No.
And they got enough people riled up that they started a siege, and they were not able to get. And these are remarkable walls in Constantinople. We talked about those the other day. Nonetheless, it turned out that there was a small breach in one of the walls, and just enough for one little man to get through. And there was a little monk. His name is Aliamos, I think, of Clary, or something like that. Alarimus of Clary. Anyway, he was just a little guy. And the Crusaders got him up to the wall and slipped him through this little crack. And there you have the Byzantine army on one side and this little monk on another.
I wouldn't want to be him.
No, you would think not. What does he do? He screams and shouts and acts like a berserker and charged the Greeks, who then turned in panic and ran.
Oh, my gosh.
And as a result, that part of the wall became available to be breached, and it was, and the Crusaders came in. They charged in. This happens on April 13th of 1204. And for 3 days, day and night, they went through that city, looting, burning, pillaging, doing anything they wanted to, taking whatever they wanted to. This is a city of 500,000 people. It was one of the great cities of the world. But it was so humiliated and so destroyed as a result of that. People began leaving. And within 50 years, the next time a census was taken, there were only 35,000 people in that entire city.
Oh, my goodness.
A city of 500,000.
500,000 to 35,000.
Yeah. It had basically become a small town.
Wow.
Now the Crusades had come full circle. You know, when you think about it, back at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II had gotten that letter from Emperor Alexius, come and help us. And now, 105 years later, the very city that called for help has been destroyed by the very
people that were called to help.
Yeah. Yeah. Now,
wow.
It goes from bad to worse now. The next question is, what do you do? And so the Crusaders then decide to create their own state, their own country, on top of the ruins of this Byzantine Empire. This is the eastern half of the empire that was founded by Constantine. What can I say? And so the language, the official language, can you imagine? This is Greece. The official language of this new country was French.
Oh, my gosh.
The Venetians came back. And so all the commerce that was done was dominated by the city of Venice. So Greek merchants were just pushed aside, or they had to work for the Venetians. Roman Catholicism was the declared official religion, despite the fact that almost everybody there was Greek Orthodox. Well, obviously, it was not destined to last very long. It had no popular support at all, neither in Byzantium nor in Western Europe. There was no, I mean, this was an embarrassment to the Pope, and we'll hear one of his letters. He was clearly upset about this, but he was powerless to do anything about it. It was not going to last long, but the sore was going to last long. The sore lasts all the way down to today. Innocent tried to encourage the Crusaders to give this thing up and to leave and continue their route down to Jerusalem. Slowly realized that this was simply not going to happen. The man who was manipulating the Crusaders in the East was the Doge again, Dandolo. One of the things he succeeded in doing was he got the Crusaders to elect as their king of Byzantium, this new kingdom of Byzantium, Baldwin. So here we have another Baldwin. He was the Count of Flanders, and he took the title Emperor. Now, there was another man who was actually much better than him. His name was the Marquis Boniface of Montferrat. But he was not elected mainly because Dandolo had rigged this election so that Baldwin would be elected. The reason why was that Baldwin had less of a personality than
easier
Boniface.
Control.
Easier to control, yeah. So then what they did was, under this leadership, quote unquote, of the Emperor Baldwin, they then divided the Byzantine Empire up into subsections, and the Venetians got all the best stuff. They made arrangements to have all the best harbors throughout the entire eastern part of the Mediterranean. They got all the really fertile land, and they also got control of the most strategic spots in the empire. Much of Romania fell under Venetian control, at least for a short while. Peloponnesus, down where Sparta is, that lower peninsula, that was controlled by them. The island of Crete was taken over by the Venetians. They also got the seaports at Thrace and at Gallipoli in the Hellespont. So it's a very important strategic spot right there between the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. They knew exactly what they were doing.
Yeah.
To make matters worse, then the Venetians turn around and they take a priest from Venice and they appoint him as the Patriarch of Constantinople. And he is given Hagia Sophia, Saint Sophia, as his cathedral. So he's set up there. Now, obviously, this is an incredible affront to everybody. It's an affront to the Greek Orthodox. They just simply took their cathedral away from them, gave it over to this guy. But it's also an affront to the Roman Church because, I mean, who is Dandolo to turn around and to name a priest a patriarch? And so he was never recognized by Pope Innocent III. No papal appointment, nothing like that. Under the control of these Latins, then sometimes they're called Franks. Everybody in the East, anybody from Europe was called a Frank. But under their control, then there was a huge raid all throughout Constantinople for any type of antiquity. And like, for instance, if you go to Venice today, as you go into the piazza going into St. Mark's, you have these four great bronze horses there. Those originally were from Constantinople. They'd been packaged up and sent back to Venice as war booty, basically. Chalices, icons, marble. They simply went in and took buildings, palaces, churches apart and stole the marble and shipped it back to Europe, or to Western Europe. There's a story that everything, but it's an apocryphal story, but there's a story that everything was taken first to the Hippodrome. Remember, that's that big amphitheater that sits 50,000 people. That everything was taken there and is piled up, and the Venetians went through and they took their 50%, and then the Crusaders were able to take what was left over. That's that's been questioned as to whether that happened or how that happened exactly. But the fact of the matter is that huge numbers of relics that we still hold to today were pillaged at this time, and many of them, quite honestly, were rather questionable. For one thing, I don't know who has it today, but somebody took off with the head of John the Baptist.
Oh, really?
Well,
that was.
Yeah, really, but I'm not so sure.
Right. Okay.
You know, somebody else took a piece of the true cross.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a lock of the Blessed Virgin's hair. All kinds of other relics, including, by the way, the Shroud of Turin. This plays into part of this, in which it disappears. There are moments in the pedigree of the shroud where it disappears and reappears. It disappears around this time, reappears about, I don't forget how many years later, back over in France, where it stays for a while. There's that fire in the chapel. Mm-hmm. It's partially destroyed. Well, it's singed on the edges. And ultimately, the family falls in need of money, and then they sell it then to the Count of Savoy, where it is then transported to Turin, where it stays today. Hmm. But part of that is included in this in some of these relics that are taken.
So it was pretty well known that it had been in Greece prior to that.
Yes. Yes, definitely. There, I'd have to go back and get my dates and everything, but there's a good pedigree during the Byzantine period. Now, prior to that, it had been lost. Since the time of the crucifixion, it had been lost, and then there was a relic that is identical to the description of the shroud that was discovered in the Byzantine Empire, and it had been sealed inside the city wall.
That's right. I remember hearing that.
Yeah,
okay.
when the city wall was torn down, it was then removed. Remember, there had been a flood in that city, and engineers had gone in to improve the wall system. Anyway, then it was transported to Constantinople, and then, of course, during this crusade, it's then lost. At least, nobody knows where it is, and then it's found again, or it re-emerges in
France. Okay.
One of the biggest pillagers in this whole operation was an abbot. His name was Abbot Martin, from a little tiny monastery in eastern France, in Alsace, actually. It's called Paris. It's not Paris, but it's Pairis, and it's a little village located near Colmar in Alsace. Anyway, he was one of the biggest enthusiasts in preaching this crusade. He went on the crusade himself, accompanied the troops to Zara and then later to Constantinople. He'll be one of those preachers who's going to be whipping up the Crusaders as they go along, and It turns out that he is quite a collector of these items too. There's another chronicler by the name of Gunther, who writes a book or a codices, I guess, or an inventory, I guess you'd say better, of some of the holy relics that were taken. It's called the Historia Constantinopolitana. And in this book, he speaks about a number of the things that were taken and brought back to Europe, including, and these are, you have to start wondering about this stuff, including a trace of Christ's blood.
Okay.
I'm going to press your incredulity a little bit further.
Right, okay.
Another piece of the true cross.
Okay.
Remember that Martin Luther several centuries later says if you take all of the pieces of the true cross throughout Europe, you could build a cathedral with them. But, and then also, and this is a direct quote, a not inconsiderable piece of St. John, the forerunner of the Lord. So that would be John the Baptist.
Okay.
a not inconsiderable piece. Yeah.
Okay.
And then also an arm bone, which was supposedly the arm of St. John the Greater. And then it goes on, and for pages and pages of these relics. And, you can almost imagine them getting all these relics and some of these Greeks, just saying, well, this thing is this or this thing is that. And they go, oh, okay. And they're kind of pressing their credulity on that. Much of the information that Gunther had gotten came through a private interview with an old man that he found at the church of the Pantocrator. And according to this, then there would not have been this heap of war booty at the Hippodrome. So take it for what it's worth, one way or the other. But it is certainly a fascinating document that tells us of the looting of this city. And it also, now even if half of the stuff or most of the stuff is not real and it's just made up, it still tells us that there is a tremendous collection there. One of the other things that the Crusaders brought back in large numbers were books. And we'll see a little bit later on what that does to learning in the West. Innocent III could only lament this. He sent a letter to the Marquis of Montferrat, the man who should have been emperor, but wasn't. And he said this. He says, having neither right nor power over the Greeks, you seem to have imprudently deviated from the purity of your vow when you marched not against the Saracens, but against the Christians, meaning not to reconquer Jerusalem, but to take Constantinople, preferring earthly riches to heavenly riches. Well, that's his verdict on the Fourth Crusade. Yes. And we'll come back a little bit later
clear.
On. Yeah, it is. And again, I think it's important for us to know that these are not lockstep, black and white issues of Christians versus Muslims and the Crusades versus jihads and all this. This is a very intricate history in which you find a lot of people working out of motivation that is anything but pure.
Right.
And so there you have that. I'll just give you a real quickie little thumbnail about other crusades that follow afterwards, and then we'll get back to this one again. But there are some 8 more crusades. In 1218, there's a Hungarian crusade. In the same year, there's the Fifth Crusade, which we'll talk about later on with some more depth. In 1228-29, there's the Crusade of Friedrich II, which is an absolute mess because this man, although he's a nominal Christian, was in any way, people called him the Antichrist back at that time. And some of the things he did, well, we'll talk about him. In 1239, there was another one led by Theobald of Navarre. In 1240, Richard of Cornwall. The more famous one is in 1246 that goes on for almost 8 years. That's the Sixth Crusade. That's the one led by St. Louis the Ninth.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you have 1270, another one led by Edward of England. And then in 1270 also, you have the crusade led by St. Louis going to Tunis where he dies. And then after that, they kind of just poop out, Well, while we're looking at this Fourth Crusade and the Pope Innocent and this creation of this anomaly in the East and all, there's also a knight that we need to talk about, a man who's just sort of a footnote in history that is really, really quite intriguing. And in some ways, he's sort of a linchpin of everything that happens on these crusades following after. And he's born in 1170, and his name is John of Brienne. And you have to go back a bit to what we were talking about earlier on, back to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, back after Saladin had already taken Jerusalem, but you still had, like Acre and one or two other towns, still port cities, held by the Latin Christians. And if you remember the time in which Almary II passes on his throne to Almary III, and then from there to Mary, and she's the daughter of Isabella and Conrad of Montferrat. And remember that Isabella is the one who had been married during the siege at Croc, and that wonderful story and all. They've all been around a long time. Well, now, follow down, and Conrad was assassinated, remember, and Isabella had two other husbands beyond that, one of those being Almary II,
right.
Has a son, Almary III. The husband dies, the son dies, she dies, and now you have baby Mary, okay? Mm-hmm. And then when she gets old enough, she's then married to this knight, to John of Brienne.
Oh.
He had come to Acre as a crusader in 1210. He was an exemplary knight. He was, if you look at what a medieval knight should be, he was that. He was a great fighter. He was courageous. He was also virtuous. And so people had a lot of respect for him. And so when the queen came of age to marry, it seemed natural that the two of them would marry. Although he was considerably older. He was 40 years old. I'm not sure how old Mary was. But anyway, they marry. And this was in 1210. 2 years later, they have a child, a daughter. Her name is Yolanda. In 1212, and then shortly after that, Mary dies.
Wow.
And Yolanda is then named. She's a little infant, but she's named the Queen of Jerusalem. The anomaly here is, of course, that she's not in Jerusalem. She's in Acre. Jerusalem is under Muslim control again. Her father is now the regent, so he's going to rule over Acre. In the name of Jerusalem. And a couple years later, Innocent III is looking around all over the Eastern Mediterranean for somebody
to help.
Yeah, somebody of some honor at all. And he gets his eye on John of Brienne. And in November of 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council is called, that great council, he is involved in that. He's invited to come to Rome. This is a huge council. There is some 412 bishops and cardinals there. There are 800 abbots, representatives from almost all the monarchies of Europe. And it's during this council, this is one of the really important councils of the Middle Ages. There's some 70 different theological and doctrinal pronouncements that are made at this council.
A lot.
Yeah. And so we'll take a look at those a little bit later on. But one of those pronouncements was a document that was entitled Ad Liberandum. And it called for a new crusade, and this time it included a book of discipline on the crusaders themselves.
Behavior.
Yeah, proper behavior. Yeah. And so basically the bottom line is that there would be if a crusader died but was not following these books, that none of the benefits of the vows would come to him. So it was a pretty strong discipline for them to behave themselves. It also declared that there should be no war all throughout Europe for the next 4 years, and war supplies should not be sold to Muslims. I think that was probably meant for the French. If the Crusader received a full remission of sins, then, and he died on that crusade, he would receive then the indulgence that would grant him entry into heaven immediately. Well, John of Brienne then comes to Rome. He pleads for this crusade. Pope Innocent III then begins a trip to go around Europe in order to whip up enthusiasm behind this new crusade. However, he himself dies while on this preaching mission. He dies at Perugia in July 16th of 1216. And so there's this new crusade that's beginning to form. A simple knight, John of Brienne, is behind it. The Pope who has begun the preaching has just died, but it's got a momentum on its own. And the two things that are going to make this effort different from the others, from the Fourth Crusade for sure, is, first of all, it's going to be led by churchmen. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to have any Venetian blinds running around, or blind Venetians running around manipulating the Crusaders.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Second is that the supplies are going to come from Pisa and Genoa, and they're not going to be dealing with the Venetians on this one at all.
That sounds like two good starts.
Yes. And the cardinals have gathered together, and they elect one of their own, Cardinal Savelli. And he's a very respected cardinal. He had served under two popes. He's a Roman. And it's a very popular choice.
Okay.
And he then begins to establish what will be the Fifth Crusade. Okay. Everyone knows that in order for this crusade to come off, you're going to have the most powerful man in Europe behind you. He's going to have to be involved. And that happens to be the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, that being Friedrich II. And Friedrich II is one of the most evil men in history.
Ooh.
So, everybody tries to woo him with carrots.
Okay.
And it's not going to work, but they're going to try nonetheless. John of Brienne offers his daughter Yolanda in marriage to
oh my gosh.
Yeah, really, to Friedrich. This happens in 1225. The Pope consecrates Friedrich as the Holy Roman Emperor. This has already happened in November of 1220. Friedrich promises to lead a crusade, and year after year doesn't do anything. And instead what he does is he spends his time in Italy. This is a man who loves Italy far more than Germany. And he spends most of his time in Italy, actually gaining stronger and stronger control of his Italian possessions. One of the things he'll do is actually establish the University of Naples as an imperial university. It's the first university in Europe that's going to be founded by a secular leader. All the other great universities have been founded by the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. Naples will be different from that. He's going to exert absolutist control over more and more of Italy. In Sicily, which is by title actually a fief of the Church. He's going to gain control over Sicily. He's going to make himself the Count of Spoleto.
Okay.
In 1224, he establishes the University of Naples. He puts in the university positions as professors lay educators. Now, most universities had priests and monks. It is, and we'll take a look later on at the development of medieval universities. But most, not all, but in most cases, they were religious. In some cases, they were laymen who were bachelors. But in this particular case, these are all lay educators, and they're all being paid by him.
Okay.
So they're state functionaries is what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's grounded, the studies are going to be grounded upon legal studies. And the books that are going to be used are something we talked about early in the course of our programs with the Corpus Juris Civilis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, those are going to be brought over, and those will be the grist of studies at this particular university. In southern Italy, as bishops died, he took over the dioceses themselves and would not allow the Pope to appoint new bishops in these dioceses.
Wow.
So he basically is appointing a priest in those dioceses to administer the diocese for him. And by 1225, his wife, earlier wife Constance, has died, and then at that point he then marries Yolanda. She's 13 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And she'll die at the age of 16. It's a very sad affair. But he wasn't interested in her as a person. Frederick was interested in nobody but Frederick.
Mm-hmm.
And Frederick used that marriage in order to claim the throne of Jerusalem. And so in order to do that, he then overthrows the regent, John of Brienne, the man who had arranged for him to become, the
Right.
wife of Yolanda. And so Friedrich then, claiming the title of King of Jerusalem, finally goes on a crusade. And everybody's relieved to get him out of Europe for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But what he does instead is he goes to the Holy Land, arrives with his army, and immediately sends diplomats to the Muslims. And in 1228, he negotiates with the Sultan of Egypt. His name is Camille.
Okay.
And he negotiates with Sultan Camille, in which there is a partial surrender of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, so that Christians would be allowed to go to these pilgrim
places.
sites.
Hmm.
Yeah. But there is no Christian army present in the Holy Land. There are no guarantees of the safety of these pilgrims. All it is an agreement that they would be allowed to go to these places. Interestingly enough, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was not included in the list of pilgrimage sites.
Wow.
So,
do we know why, or it's just something he wasn't interested in negotiating for?
I guess not. He got the best deal he could. Did a crusade without anybody spilling any blood.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was happy with the results. John was not.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
John of Brienne, eventually then, he becomes the head of a papal army who's intending to, I don't know, try to punish Friedrich or something. But he leads an army in southern Italy and Sicily against Friedrich, is not terribly successful at that, and ultimately goes to Constantinople. And in Constantinople, he's given the title of co-emperor of Latin Byzantium.
Okay.
This was in 1231. And on two different occasions, he will defend the city of Constantinople against two different attacks. Unfortunately, both of these are Christian attacks. One of them led by John III of Nicaea. So it's a Greek Byzantine Greek Orthodox attempting to get their city back.
Uh-huh.
And then later from the north, Ivan II of Bulgaria also attacks, trying to get the city. And again, he defends the city for the Latin Christians. He dies at the age of 67 in 1237, and he is buried in the habit of a Franciscan. I'm assuming that he was a Third Order Franciscan.
Okay.
Well, this Fifth Crusade that had gotten underway, that he had been part of, and Innocent had preached, and Friedrich was playing games with, and all that. It, as I said before, it has a momentum of its own, and although it turns out to be no more successful, it is a very large attempt. Germans go down the Rhine River to the Netherlands, German crusaders, and there in Holland they'll get on ships in ports and then make their way through the English Channel. English crusaders will join them from Dartmouth, and they make their way along the English Channel, along the Bay of Biscay, and then along the coast of Spain and Portugal, stopping just long enough to make a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. Down along Portugal, they get as far as Lisbon, and they spend a little time in Lisbon taking provisions. The Bishop of Lisbon says, "Hey, you guys, would you help me with this castle we're having a little problem with?" So they all went on over and whooped up on the moors, and then continued on their way. Eventually, they made their way to Acre. So this is on the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, and this is in spring of 1218. There were two other Crusader armies that had also gathered there, smaller armies. One of those was King Andrew II of Hungary, and then also Duke Leopold VI of Austria. And then they held a war council. What should we do? Where should we attack? And they decided not to attack Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be too hard. They would probably be unsuccessful. And besides that, the real power in the Muslim world at that point was Egypt. And so if they attack in Jerusalem, Egypt would simply come in and stab them in the back. So they decided instead to attack Egypt. And so they sailed down to the northern coast of Egypt, and they began attacking fortifications on an island area called Damietta. It's near Cairo.
Okay.
And in order to take that region, they had to destroy the fortress towers that were there. And then also there was a large chain that the Muslims had put all the way across the Nile River so that you couldn't get any ships to go, up the Nile. And so they eventually did that, but it took 2 years in order for them to reduce the fortresses at Damietta. While they were there, who arrives on the scene but none other than St. Francis of Assisi.
Oh my gosh.
And basically Francis told them, forget it. You are not going to succeed. This is not going to work. And he instead preached sermons of peace and reconciliation between the Christian Crusaders and the Muslims. And they basically told him no, and he basically said, if you continue this attack, you're going to lose. And then with that, he got permission to cross the Nile River to go to the Sultan himself.
Francis did this?
St. Francis went to Al-Kamil. He suggests also that there be peace between Muslims and Christians. It's one of the reasons why, Assisi it was the site. Remember, not too many years ago of this big confab of different religions, because Francis is this big reconciler. He's trying to be, at least. Anyway, one of the things he does is he suggests to the Sultan that he preach to the Sultan, and if the Sultan was open to his preaching, he might convert. And the Sultan basically says, okay, give it your best shot. So Francis preaches this sermon to Sultan al-Kamil, in which he basically says to the Sultan that you need a personal, spiritual self-renewal. And this is the understanding of true jihad. Well, if you remember, the concept of jihad in Islam, the large jihad is in fact me working on my person in order to be more acceptable to God.
Right.
The little jihad is going out and killing people. And so he emphasizes that. And in the end, the Sultan says, wow, I'm really impressed. That's a neat sermon, but I'm not converting. And let's have peace anyway.
Okay.
And so Francis goes back over to the Christian side and says, the Sultan has offered us peace. We can live in harmony. And the Crusaders basically said, thanks for your effort, but no thanks.
We want to fight.
And they did.
Oh.
In November of 1219, Damietta fell. And by this time, most of the people had succeeded in getting out and getting back over to the other side of the Nile River. There were some 10,000 people who had were captured at the fall of Damietta. Some of the Crusaders had left, including John of Brienne. He had gone back to Acre. Other Crusaders attacked. And it turned out to be an absolute disaster, just as St. Francis had predicted. When they attacked Cairo, they were mowed down by Turkish archers who were able to shoot at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
By that time, they had the Nile River had flooded in its annual flood, and so they weren't able to retreat. So now they were caught basically in a triangle, and the long and short of it was all the Crusaders had to surrender.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, they were then given pen and paper to write back to their families and say, "You want to see this guy again? Send us money." And it was a wonderful way of a fundraiser for the Egyptians.
Oh my gosh.
We have one more crusade to look at next time around. That'd be Louis IX. I think we have a couple minutes
do have
left.
time.
So I'd like to really put some of this in perspective. It's nice, I think, for us to step back out of all the muck and see what's going on. And to do that, I'd like to read a couple paragraphs from Thomas Madden's book. This is Crusades, the Illustrated History, Christendom, Islam, Pilgrimage, and War. And he's the editor of this particular book. And he begins by two paragraphs that I'd just like to read, okay? It says, religious wars, once thought to be an artifact of distant past, has reemerged in recent years. A spate of Islamist terrorist attacks have reminded the Western world that for many people, religion is still a reason to kill and to be killed. That is a hard lesson for the West, which long ago relegated religious belief to personal preferences and celebrates religious diversity. It requires Westerners to look beyond modern sensibilities to the medieval worldview that for them has largely passed away, for it has not passed away everywhere. Out of a desire to understand today's events, many commentators turn to Christianity's holy wars, the Crusades. It was their legacy, some contend, that has led directly to the attacks. And that's not true, but some contend that. When President George W. Bush spoke of a new war on terrorism as a quote-unquote crusade, he was roundly criticized for the perceived suggestion that it was a war of Christianity against Islam. His aides apologized, saying that the president had only used the term in the sense of a campaign, but in the Middle East, the remark was thought to confirm a popular assessment of Americans and Europeans as, quote-unquote, crusaders. you remember that comment that was made. He was making that comment in a similar fashion that, if you remember, Dwight D. Eisenhower had in his book on World War II, he called it a crusade for Europe. He didn't mean that in any kind of a religious sectarian way. It's a word that's used in the West that is commonly used. We talk about that all the time. I can't tell you the number of high schools in the United States that are
Crusaders.
Called the Crusaders. That's right. It's not a big deal. But anyway, that's part of the misunderstanding that has. And so let me read the last couple paragraphs then in his book, in which he's again goes back to this question of a clash of civilizations. And Dr. Madden says this: what of the Western side of the clash? In the wake of September 11th, President George W. Bush declared, quote, "This crusade, this war on terrorism, is going to take a while," unquote. His aides rapidly denied that he had used the term literally, but it still provoked a storm in the Muslim world. It is doubtful whether the West's leaders or its media are conscious of the historical root of crusade is the Latin crux, meaning cross. But this root is not lost in Arabic, which has no single word for crusade, and translates it, for example, as Harb al-Salib, the War of the Cross, or Harb Salabiyya, Cross War, or Hamil Salabiyya, Cross Attack. It is hardly surprising that Muslims are sensitive to the term. Certainly, to some Muslim propagandists at least, the rhetoric of the conflict is expressed in religious terms as being against Christians and Crusaders, even if in reality against American globalization and secularization. At the same time, Crusader can simply be used in the Muslim world as a pejorative word for the Western European. Now, contemporary secular French, you have a hard time thinking them as Crusaders, but now being called that. But more importantly, both sides in the propaganda war bandy the terms crusade and jihad very loosely and invoke history in a cavalierly simplistic manner. Those who speak of crusade conveniently forget, and we're just covering this, the Fourth Crusade and others where Christians fought Christians, not to mention times when Muslims allied with Crusaders against other Muslims. And those who trumpet Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem conveniently forget that his descendants handed back the holy city to the Franks 39 years later. You know, so I think it's just a fascinating study for us. It helps to keep everything in perspective. That what we're going through today is nothing entirely new. It has a history to it, but the history is much more complex than the black and white version we get on the front pages of American newspapers.
And that's an understatement.
Yes, it is.
All right. Well, goodness, Father, thank you so much. And can we close today with a prayer and your blessing?
Sure enough. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.